recording. It's 9:01 and start streaming. Update information. Alright. Believe we are live. How are there already people in chat? This is too fast. I just hit the button.
I mean, you sent out the link earlier. I'm sure that
It's true.
folks,
People just loaded it up or waiting
yeah,
for us to go live.
they've been on tenterhooks.
Yeah, yeah, seriously. All right, so we're live. Interview 14. Not pretty but wonderful designers in conversation. Who are you?
My name is Humza Kazmi. I'm a partner with the Hydra Cooperative, independent OSR publisher. Um, that's my RPG connection. Day job wise, I'm an immigration attorney.
I mean, we're going to be touching on both of those, I'm pretty sure, given everything going on. Okay, cool. So we were talking before briefly, and I actually had no idea how early you got started because for me, I think my introduction to you is somewhere around 2016. Not like the first time we spoke, but the first time I became aware of you.
Mm.
And like, I think I became aware of Hydra Co-op and you basically simultaneously. Um, and so for me, you've always kind of like been enmeshed in that world, and I think you've continued on in the OSR vein through ups and downs. I mean,
Hmm.
a lot of your work has been under the Hydra Co-op banner. Um, Probably the majority of your work at this
Yes.
point. Um, and I'd kind of never really thought you were around before then. Like, I didn't think you were like an AD&D author who I just never
No,
heard
no.
of. But we were talking, and yeah, you had a credit in the mid 2000s, several actually.
So, right as I was finishing up high school, I was digging into. You remember TSR released a Dragon magazine archive,
Hmm.
like the first 250 issues on CD-ROM.
Yep.
So I picked that up from my local game store and started looking through them, just devouring these, right? And I found out about this game, Paranoia, um, and I I hadn't really thought seriously about comedy RPGs before. Um, like thinking about it, the first RPG I ever played was actually Steve Jackson Games' Toon. But
Okay.
after that initial introduction, I didn't really think about it. I stuck with D&D and other sci-fi and fantasy stuff. But I found these articles in Paranoia, and I thought, hey, this is funny. This is really interesting. Let me find out more about this. And I started Google searching at just the right time. There was a very active fan community uh, at a website called paranoialive.net,
Okay.
and uh, they were like it seemed interesting. I hopped in. They were looking for volunteer mods. I became a volunteer mod, and then um, the site was approached by a gentleman folks may be familiar with, Alan Varney, who's had a long running career in games and is currently the operator of the Bundle of Holding. Um, and Alan basically said, hey, Mongoose is putting out a new edition of Paranoia, and I'd like to turn to the community for ideas, brainstorming, contributions, and I got a chance to see Paranoia. I think the XP uh,
Yeah.
moniker was formally dropped, but it was certainly Paranoia XP for a while. Um, I got to see the playtests going on for that, got to read through early drafts, and wound up contributing portions here and there.
Is this
And
this was all while you were still in high school?
it was the tail end of high school
Okay.
and my like first couple of years of undergrad,
Okay.
and then I think midway through undergrad, um, I I think I wound up saying that, yeah, I'd really like to join the what was called the Trader Recycling Studio, which was the freelancer studio that Alan had put together to work on Paranoia products.
What an extremely paranoia name for that.
It was pretty excellent. He had run a game of something called Lexicon,
Okay.
um, which was what like it's a wiki based like setting development game, which
Huh.
actually suspect would be something folks might look into for like group development
Yeah, I'm gonna
of
write that down.
settings and world building.
Actually, lexicon.
Lexicon, yeah.
Okay, writing that down
Like
now.
I would might try, I might try searching for like quote lexicon wiki game or unquote or something like
Sure.
that to pull it up. Um, and I hadn't been involved in that. But the people he brought in on that, I guess he found folks from there and was able to assess their writing qualities, sense of humor, style, and created the Trader Recycling Studio from that group. It included a couple of the other moderators at Paranoia Live, and I made some note about wanting to join in, and they graciously invited me in. And I was able to contribute to small ways, but I was able to contribute to a couple of the books that were released under that. Unfortunately, the work I was having my first sort of solo flight on, it would have been titled Brave New Complex, and I was writing the Star Trek parody section.
Okay.
Um, like it basically a total conversion for Paranoia to give you, tools for riffing on the Star Trek parody, and people had all sorts of other parodies in there. There was of course the requisite D&D parody,
Sure.
but there was also like yes, Paranoia in the framework of the Avignon papacy, and actually a Paranoia campaign too, where
The
you had
Avignon papacy.
the
Why?
Avignon
Why is
papacy.
why is that a choice?
It seemed like I don't remember who was working on it, and my apologies to whichever colleague of mine I'm grossly offending. Sorry guys, it's been a while. But so there were a couple of these like one-off conversions, but also like a bona fide campaign where people would play like different alternate universe versions of the same character, going through like maybe 4 or 5 different alternate universes, all with like one overarching uh, goal. So you got to see different twisted versions of Alpha Complex as you were going through the entire process. And I think it was partially to push back at the idea that, oh, you can't run a Paranoia campaign, it's only for one shots.
Sure.
Anyway, the Trader Recycling Studio was working on this. The book was very close to completion, or basically there. It was either immediately pre-layout or 1 or 2 steps before that, and Mongoose pulled the line in house. The book got canceled. So I still have my notes for red shirts, and I still, once in a while think about, hey, what would be needed to turn it into its own game. But I've also, just not had the bandwidth to sit down and think about what that would look like.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, right? You have simultaneously maintained a successful career in a desperately high pressure field and at the same time been a producer at one of the most well regarded OSR pubs out there. So, yeah, I don't really know when you'd find the time. That said, I could fuck with some Star Trek Paranoia. I think that would be a fun thing for me to play. So, if you ever do find the time, yeah, you've got at
I'll
least
let you
one
know,
person.
100%.
Cool. Um, okay. How old are you, by the way?
Just turned 33.
Okay, so we're pretty close. I'm 30. I'll be 31 this year. Um, how is Toon the first game you played?
Um, a kid in elementary school brought it to like fourth grade and was organizing a group. Um, there there were a bunch of kids, a bunch of the fifth graders, when I was in fourth grade, had had picked up like Toon, D&D, um, what was it? Gamma World.
Okay.
Um, Someone organized a Blood Bowl league, so I got exposed to a lot at that point.
Okay. Interesting. In school, right? Like
Hmm.
I also started at a very young age, but it like was not an in school thing. In school, the options were probably Magic the Gathering, the Pokemon card game, and AD&D
Mm.
in like the it wasn't an after school program. It was just called Clubhouse. It was if your parents couldn't pick you up from school when you were in
Mm.
elementary school, you like got put in this room, and there was like a guy who would play AD&D with kids.
Huh. So there's like a dedicated adult GM for the group, like keeping watch over them.
Yeah, basically,
Mm.
like there was a room and like there were computers and books and things like that. But there was one guy who played. He would run AD&D for kids.
Gotcha.
And like in retrospect, it was definitely like a heavily stripped down version of AD&D because when I was first introduced to actual AD&D, I had no familiarity whatsoever. It was just completely alien to me. Um, but yeah, I mean, I went to hobby stores all the time
Mm.
in New York. You're based out of DC, right?
Yeah, DC suburbs.
Okay. Did you grow up in DC suburbs?
Hmm.
Okay, cool. I yeah, I'm trying to think. I know people that grew up around there, but I like don't have a real sense of like what the nerd community was like in the 90s.
So
Um,
uh, I I can't say I really interacted with the nerd community outside of school,
sure.
right? Like I was generally, pretty much a homebody. Um, Most of my friends lived in one part of the county. I lived like half an hour away, so not really feasible to like walk over to a friend's house and play a game or something.
Yeah,
So um, my interactions with them were at school or like individualized sessions of okay, you'll go over to one friend's house and hang out there.
sure. Play dates.
So exactly. So gaming was by and large something that happened at school, like either at recess and lunch or on the bus rides back home.
What is on the bus rides? What
Oh
is
yeah.
just like very loose? Did you LARP on the bus? Like what does that look like?
I mean, it looks like kids taking the various D&D or Gamma World rule sets and basically running a diceless improv game, right? Um,
Okay,
so still very much informed by the rule books, but it was like 3/4 let's pretend
sure.
to 1/4 D&D or Gamma World or whatever, just in terms of how you're engaging with the setting.
Okay, so how do you go from Toon being your first game and like this extremely light hacked version of AD&D and D and Gamma World played on a bus or like played within the confines of a school at lunchtime and then Paranoia and then you kind of just disappear into the regular normie world for a bit and then you come back and you're like in the OSR.
So the through line there is that after after elementary school, right? Like I'd been playing this awesome game. I saw the books at Borders back when there was Borders. Pour one
Oh,
out.
RIP.
um, and like I was exposed to the various like D&D rule books and so forth, and so the first RPG I started with was very much AD&D second edition,
Okay.
and that's what I would run through like middle school and high school, and up until I got into Paranoia. And
Wow.
then in undergrad, after the Trader Recycling Studio was sort of, after things went back in house, and after I was getting a bit burned out on Paranoia,
Sure.
because along with the stuff for the Trader Recycling Studio, Paranoia Live basically had a very active immersive play-by-post component as well.
I remember those
So
days.
um, so after that, I was getting burned out on the setting of Paranoia, and I said, you know what, let me go back to D&D. Right? And I had been sticking with second edition despite third edition coming out,
Hmm.
um, in part because it had been enough of a difficult battle to convince my parents that no, I really needed these like expensive $30 per book things, and
Yeah.
then having finally acquired all of them, how am I going to say, yeah, so I need a new set of $90 worth of stuff?
Yeah.
Um, that, and you couldn't play a elf fighter mage right out of the gate, which was clearly a sign that the new edition was no good whatsoever. So, uh, what can I say? I had
Yeah.
an
No.
elf
No.
fighter
No.
mage,
I
and
get it.
I stuck with it.
You have to. You have to draw the line somewhere.
Exactly. So, I wound up like in the way that kids can, like being very angry and huffy and rejecting third edition and sticking with my second edition stuff. Um, which made me an obnoxious prat when dealing with people playing 3E, but I grew out of it ultimately.
It's
Um,
a stage.
um, but I was sticking with second edition, and then when I decided to go back to D&D after going hard into Paranoia, I wound up gravitating back towards second edition D&D. And uh, that stage, the late undergrad to early law school.
So this is late aughts at this point.
Yeah,
Okay.
um, like 2009. 2009, I graduated undergrad and went off to law school.
Okay.
So 08, 09, I was definitely starting to become aware of OSR blogs, starting to follow stuff, and
That's extremely early.
but I wasn't really participating in the community as a participant, right?
Okay.
Like it was a one-way thing where I'm lurking, I'm reading message boards and seeing people discuss stuff, but not actually
Sure.
engaging as a
This
participant.
is like the Dragon's Meat era, like early Osric just came out sort of deal.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was like Grognardia, Trollsmith,
Okay.
a couple of others.
Sure.
Um, and so I wound up being a pretty early G plus adopter,
Okay.
because I had friends working at Google and they said, hey, why not try this thing out? And I hopped on board, and a lot of the OSR community wound up gravitating towards G plus. Hey, here's a way that we can all hop in and run games. And so, because I was in early on G plus, that facilitated my, I guess, getting introduced to the community at a point when there was a very solid and robust framework for welcoming new folks in,
Mm-hmm.
and a chance to like readily interact with folks, who you were writing your favorite blog or whatever.
Mm-hmm. This was the early high days of collaboration era of
Exactly.
the OSR. Like
100%.
the time where the people who ended up becoming like the most firmly staunch got it because like it was a good time.
Yeah.
Um, it was the time to. The reason I didn't is I didn't come back into analog games until like 2014,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't like start really interacting with people until 2015. Like by that point, it's entrenched.
Yeah.
It's people broke in at that point, but you had to like make something really dope. And
You
then
had to
you'd be
work at it.
you had to work at it, right? You couldn't just hop in. Whereas like
Yeah.
I could get on games Twitter and you
Mm.
just shitpost a lot, and like that's fine. That's an acceptable way to be. Um, G Plus expected you to like make a thing, to have a good blog, create some good content. Um,
Or at the very least, like have substantive engagement with people's posts and creations.
mhm.
But even by 14 or 15, like the entrenchment that you're talking about was there. I think because folks wound up getting overloaded on circles, and so it I'm sure it just became so hard to like find the good content that was going on.
Yeah. I mean, that was a big issue for me, and why to this day I'm still not good at blogs.
Mm,
Right? There is there's such a surplus. Right? I pay for Feedly and Pocket. Right? I have multiple reading apps so that I don't lose content
mm.
because I'm subscribed to so many blogs and just they feed through, and like I'm like, okay, I have 1,000 to look at right now. Let me just
Yeah.
scroll through and see if anything catches my eye. Um, I could barely do that when I was a kid, and all I did was read games. Like, I don't know, the energy or the time. Like, I want to take a nap. Um, okay,
That is
so
fair.
I get the through line. I get the arc that you sketched out in terms of personal interest. What's the step from getting on G Plus, finding the OSR, becoming a participating member in kind of the discourse that was going on at that point, to working with Hydra Co-op?
The step there was hopping into uh, an open games call that Chris Kotalik put out in 2011 for a Stormbringer game.
Okay,
Um, so
Stormbringer.
Stormbringer.
Okay,
So
BRP fantasy.
side note about Stormbringer. I picked up a copy in high school, right? And I was curious. I liked the Elric books. And then young me reads through it and thinks, "Oh well, this is just D&D with a different system. What's so good about this?" And I wound up trading it for a second edition Shadowrun book. Now, don't get me wrong, Shadowrun is a setting very near and dear to my heart,
Sure.
but I still regret that trade.
Yeah. It is hard to find a good condition any edition of Stormbringer these days. Um, we'll come back to Shadowrun. Okay, so Chris Kotalik puts out this
Yeah,
open call for a Stormbringer game in 2011,
yeah.
and
I
what
hop
just
in on. It was like, hey, send me your name and what you're looking for. And he posted like cursory rules for rolling up a character. I roll one up. I'm slotted into one of these games. The game runs like maybe 5 sessions. It doesn't take off, but Chris invites me to the Hill Cantons game that he's running,
okay,
BX D&D, and this is during law school, right?
sure,
Like um, my last year of law school. Um, so I say, okay, what the heck? I hop into that. I I check. Excuse me. This was the Flail Snails era where people were hopping back and forth between like a gazillion different old school D&D
yep,
campaigns with, you know, one character who's roving here and there. And so I had played in one Flail Snails game before this, and my character got like possessed by a fox demon.
okay. So
And
so real quick, I think
yeah,
we need to put some context to flail snails,
sure.
right? Because there are going to be people watching this and people eventually reading this who have never heard that term before.
Okay.
Okay, so
So Flail Snails was an idea put forward by three people, one of whom is a freaking terrible person, one of whom is I think a nice decent guy, but with a gigantic blind spot for this aforementioned terrible person. And then the third I don't really know, but
sure,
this thing was an agreement that okay, if people start in a campaign that's playing by these rules, the flail snails conventions,
hmm
you start a character, you agree that they're coming in with no they're starting from scratch, rolling up a new character in whatever system you want, and the idea is basically, look, all of the editions of D&D from OD&D up to AD&D second edition, like they're close enough that you can bring a character through without too much fuss. And there are also other games out there like D&D Third or Fourth, or RuneQuest or Stormbringer or Tunnels and Trolls, where you can port a D&D character into that, and you have to do a little bit of elbow grease, but you can get them there and get a reasonable facsimile. So the idea was that, hey, in order to get people playing more, you just bring your character from one place to the next, bring whatever wacky stuff you pick up in one campaign, bring it over to the next one. Um, and it was something that legitimately did help foster a community of players, helped foster a lot of inter-community dialogue as you had people talking about what was going on in this campaign or that campaign. And if folks are familiar with the West Marches idea that I think Ben Robbins
Yeah.
uh, wrote up several years ago, one of the things that the West Marches playstyle relied on was the idea that there would be kind of a soft competition between player groups as these impromptu player groups wound up competing for the big scores in the campaign. Flail Snails set that up, but across multiple campaigns.
I mean, that is an excellent description. It's a fairly unique thing. I can't really think of anything. I'm sure there's some example buried in like the old world of play by post, but I really can't think of anything that did what Flail Snails did.
I think that the closest analogs are probably like what's it called either stuff that was going on in like the very early D&D days where it was um, like bringing characters between campaigns was
Sure.
something that was discussed. That and things like Shadowrun's Runner Hub, which is a Reddit community
Yeah.
with a massively shared world.
So you have okay. So you have examples like the World of Darkness live chats, um, where it's a singular world with multiple campaigns operating it inside of it. Um, and like those are, but that's like MUDs, right?
Mm.
Like that type of thing goes back a long way. Um, I think what made Flail Snails unique was the system hopping, right? It,
Mm.
and that it wasn't a cohesive world. It was just like I'm gonna teleport into a different universe now.
Yeah,
Um, that is what really distinguished it, for me at least.
I think that's a fair comment, and I mean, people were definitely willing to lampshade that. So, Chris, in the early days of the Hill Cantons, the Chris Katalik's game I mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
um, it was Flail Snails open. Gradually, once we got a stable play group, it kind of stopped being a Flail Snails setting and just it's another campaign doing its own thing.
Okay.
But in that, like when someone would show up with a new character who hasn't been there before, the official line was, "Oh, and here's a new character falling from the sky, Time Bandit style."
Okay.
Like, yes, this makes no sense. We're just dealing with it. Here's the character. Let's keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't pause. Don't think about it too much. You
Yeah.
just got a new party member.
hmm
Um,
And this one happens to have a phaser and a spell that summons a single Dimetrodon that has to be shared across multiple games.
okay. Because what they just got pulled in from Carcosa or something.
I mean I don't remember where the spell came from, but it was like the spell specifically said this summons one single Dimetrodon, like Bob, and if Bob is killed, this spell will no longer work for whoever has it.
Okay. Um, that's a weird era. Weird era in games. Um,
Very much so. But
okay, so
circling
yeah, back to
back,
the story.
like I hopped into Chris's Tuesday nights campaign, um, and I said, okay, I need a new character. I'd rolled up a couple. The last one, like I said, possessed by a fox demon, no longer playable. Scratch him off the list. Well, who do I have? I've got an elf with 2 hit points. This guy's toast. Whatever. YOLO. And so I hop in, and this 2 hit point elf who I'm convinced is going to bite it in the very first session. It winds up continuing on, makes it to level 2, gets all the way up to 4 hit points. Actually gets all the way up to level 5 before getting killed for the first time.
Okay.
And getting up to level 5 is a process that took like legit years because the Hill Cantons is very slow in PC advancement.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, this was a couple of years of very regular play.
Okay.
And he gets to level 5 before breaking his full neck climbing up a rope.
Oh.
It was a completely ridiculous and asinine way to go, and it was hilarious, and I loved it.
It's an extremely OSR death.
Exactly. Um, Winds up getting reincarnated as a were shark, gets killed again, gets reincarnated as a Neanderthal dwarf.
Okay.
Anyway, the point is, I was in Chris's long running campaign, like, stuck with it for many years. We played through the Slumbering Ursine Dunes as one of the very first things going on in the campaign.
Okay.
Um,
So you
Going
saw you
down,
saw the early proto version of what ended up becoming Slumbering Urside Dunes.
yes,
Okay.
played through that. Our characters fixated on the golden barge that's on the book cover.
Mm-hmm.
Made many expeditions to try and figure out its secrets. Thought we had it. Came up with a plan for getting it, and then Chris was also running a home group in parallel, like a group meeting in person
Mm-hmm.
down in Texas. The home group comes in, does something. The Eld show up and take the barge away. So right before we had like our session where we're about to go enact our plan to like free this beached golden barge. So we're all trooping out there and there's just nothing. A wide empty nothing.
Oh god, I would be so mad.
It was hilarious and excellent.
Okay. Okay, so is it just that you're in Chris Katolik's game for
Um,
years and he puts out Slumbering Urside Dunes and then he's just like, "Oh, Humza, do you want to
kind
produce the
of,
next one?"
kind of like the Hydra. So the current company is actually Chris's second shot at it. There was a previous shot that was formed in like maybe 20 uh 2011, 2012 or something, but
Okay.
it wound up not working out. Um, but the second incarnation of the cooperative, it started with Chris, Robert Parker, and Anthony Pastores,
Mm-hmm.
who Robert and Anthony were both long running campaign players,
Okay.
and the three of them started the company and put out Sud, and then like I wasn't part of the company, but Chris and Robert and Anthony were all good friends. I was, cheerleading the Kickstarter and chatting with them about how things were going, and continued to chat about, hey, what's the next steps? How's it going? You know, as a friend, an
Sure.
interested, involved friend, but ultimately, like when the second book was rolling around, I said, "Oh, you guys need a hand? I can do proofreading or whatever." And proofreading turned into this and it turned into that, and I wound up taking on a larger and larger role, and then ultimately in 2016 I wound up hopping on as a full partner.
Okay.
um, Both myself and I think, yeah, Trey Causey and I both joined in 2016.
So that was after Eld or after Marlenko?
um, it was after Marlinko. um, Trey and I joined. Actually, no, wait. I'm sorry. I might be mixing up my chronology here. No, I guess I joined in 2015, and I think Trey did at the same time. But 2016 was the first time that we were all able to get together in person.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I omitted Mike Davison. Mike was another of the Plank members of Hydra,
I,
and he's the one who did layout on Sud and Marlinko.
you were. I gotta mention, you're just wildly courteous. Um,
I
just like
mean,
the deepest and most heartfelt apology because in a late night interview in the midst of everything going on, you forgot a person. Um,
he's a colleague and he's a friend, and I'd feel bad if I
yeah,
if I didn't shout him out.
no, fair. I appreciate it. Um, okay, so since then you've had six books under your belt through the co-op.
Hmm,
Five?
let's see. Marlinko, Eld, What Ho,
Huh.
and then additional work on Lorn Song.
Lorn Song.
Lorn Song is very much mine, and then sort of additional work on Mordzingersturm, Strange Stars, OSR. So that's up to six.
Yeah.
But I would not count my contributions there as particularly large. I
Okay.
and I
Unfathomable?
Yes, Op Unfathomable and Odious Uplands is about to hit. Fingers crossed.
Is that going to a crowdfunding or is that just dropping?
No.
Okay.
So Odious Uplands is the sequel to Operation Unfathomable. Um, it was part of the stuff that was in the initial Kickstarter. For various reasons, real life delays on a lot of people's parts. It's been a while coming, but
Okay.
now the manuscript is basically locked in. It's heading over to Jez Gordon for
Tight just does great work.
yeah, and he's the one who did Operation Unfathomable as well.
Hmm.
So he's going to be hitting the layout there, and then uh, we're we're getting the omnibus DCC version together as well.
Okay. I didn't know that was coming. That's
Yeah,
cool.
no, the omnibus DCC version and the omnibus of Operation Unfathomable and
Hmm.
Odious Uplands are both things that are going to be coming out as well.
Okay. So, okay, I'm trying to think of which of these questions is the most interesting to immediately go with. So the top order question is, what's it like working still very firmly in the OSR, and I want to say an increasingly post OSR world? That's the top level question. I think probably more tangibly, like, what is the working process on this, right? I think when a lot of people look at the OSR, both from the inside and the outside, one of the companies that's held up as like consistently putting out incredibly good work, um, and generally being decent people
We try.
is, yeah, right. It's you guys. It's unfortunate that it's a small list when you put those two factors together. Um, but like that's, I remember when I first found out about co-op, it was like, oh, I'm kind of dicey on OSR folk, but co-op seems decent and they put out good stuff. And like that was my core introduction. And I feel like you've maintained that reputation and have grown it personally and professionally. Um, I don't know, what's the world, what is today's world like for you and for Hydra Co-op that was different from when you first started, when I first became aware, like
Okay,
5 years ago?
so a couple of things. I mean, I'm a brown guy working on games. There aren't that many South Asian folks working in RPGs. There are a few. Shout outs to to my friends and colleagues, but there aren't that many, and that's always been a constant. But I think I've become more and more aware of that and what that means, and um, I guess more and more aware of um, the ways that it's important to make it easier for other marginalized folks to have an entry point into being able to create and facilitating making their voices, which were already at the table, but making sure that those voices are heard and heard well. Um, so, in terms of what's changed since starting out in 2014, 2015, um, I guess a greater awareness of what's going on in the scene and what people are doing, and a greater willingness to try and take responsibility for and actively try to make things easier and better for folks. Um, in terms of your comment about whether we're in a post OSR world, um, I mean, maybe, but in some ways, like OSR design is, certainly stems out of the idea that you're going back to the classic D&D framings and saying, "Hey, what can we glean from this? What can we still latch onto and do good stuff with um, going forward?" And there are a couple of ways of taking that. One is, what if we cleave to this and this alone? And the other is, what if we take this as a jumping off point? What if we take this and see what we can do and what still holds up, in reevaluation, and assuming that the people designing the stuff had intentionality behind it, what holds up and what works. And I think that there's still a very valid and open role um, for things in that second category to innovate and to do new stuff while still maintaining that design linkage and that um, that intentionality of this style of play and this early design still has worth and is not necessarily something obsolete. The first school, the school of this stuff was fine just as it is, like that'll still be there. There are going to be folks latching onto these old systems and continuing to work specifically within those boundaries. That's not exactly where I'm at these days,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I think it's important to look at the look at those boundaries and say, assume these are there for a reason, but also consider what new places we can go using this as a baseline. And I think that that's a goal that at least has not changed from from starting to dip my toe into the OSR framework.
So I will say, regarding my comment on it being a post OSR world, the way I personally see that
Hmm.
is I agree with your two camps, right? And I think of them as, these are going to be the wrong words, but they'll work. Exclusionary and inclusionary. Not in terms necessarily of their social aspect, but of how they approach mechanics and the tech of design, right? The exclusionary camp is that first camp. We nailed it. Or at the very least, I don't need to mess with the new stuff. Um,
Right.
I think you're right, they will, to an extent, always exist. They seem to have fallen by the wayside in a way that is more dramatic than in the early OSR. Um, the second portion, the inclusionary, I guess is the reverse of exclusionary, seems to have both grown substantially, but has succeeded in, or to an extent, it's not there yet, but has succeeded to an extent in actually causing some genuine cross pollination. Um, and you see this in some very tangible ways, right? The concept of Sword Dream is an explicit marker of OSR design sensibility melded with other things. Um, you also see this in the personal, right? You have people I think of as like firmly on the indie side right? People who I met going to like indie cons in the mid 2010s, back when like the war was at its hottest and people just did not cross over to the other camp.
Hmm.
Um, Openly being like, wait, I should actually pay attention to like some of the interesting OSR stuff that's coming out because
Hmm.
there's actually like really good lessons to learn. And seeing that come from people who were 4 or 5 years ago firmly OSR. Um, like the cross pollination side won. And in that framework, I think we're both in a post indie and post OSR world. We haven't arrived at whatever the new thing is going to be yet, but I think we're past the point where those camps have the same identities and are as useful terms as they once were.
I think that's fair. I think it's very worthwhile to draw a distinction between OSR as design philosophy and OSR as camp or community or scene. And each of those words has different different utilities
Yeah.
for different parts of it. Um, I think that OSR as design space is one point, and OSR as scene is a far more nebulous one.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certainly excited to see what shows up from post OSR as scene, while still being very much in the camp of you know OSR's design philosophy and design ethos, and saying, yeah, this is kind of the stuff I'm still most interested in working with.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even
Um,
in your own work, I'd correct me if you feel that what I'm about to say is incorrect, right? But I feel like I've seen an evolution of the Hydra Co-op works, right? I feel if I look at Sud and What Ho side by side, it's I understand which is a later book.
mm,
Um, it's not to say that like What Ho is a growth over Sud, right? If anything, I think I probably Eld's probably my favorite, but like Sud's probably my second favorite. Um,
that's fair. Sud was very tightly written.
yeah,
And side note, a lot of that credit goes to Anthony, who is unfortunately stepped away from the RPG scene.
I mean that's it, it happens a lot and it goes in cycles.
For
We
sure, yeah.
we lose a lot of good people.
Hmm.
Um, but despite that, right? Despite probably my two favorite books being one that's 3 years old or 4 years old and one that's 5 or 6 years old, um, I can still determine that like there is a growth. And then I
Yeah,
see like something like Lorn Song, and like Lorn Song feels like I see how Lorn Song comes out of an OSR world, but also Lorn Song doesn't feel like what I'd if I gave like the five emblematic texts of the OSR, Lorn Song doesn't feel like any of them um, to me, and so I see this world in which the design sensibility and the design lessons of the OSR are still there and they're still valuable, but new people are taking them, new voices are using them, and they're making something interesting.
I think that's fair. And I think that there's been a good bit of more intentionality in trying to promote and foster some of the new voices who are coming up. Um, I mean, I'm honestly kind of astonished that we were the first ones to publish a book by Zedek, because
Yeah,
he's been active in the scene for a while.
and
And
lauded in the scene.
yeah,
Like that when that clicked that you guys were the first to publish Zedek, other than Zedek publishing his own zines, I was like, how the fuck did it take this long? How did nobody just be like, yo Zedek, let me give you a bunch of money right now, so that you can make a book and have it be published by us?
I mean, yeah, I don't know. And I'm really glad and really honored that he was interested in working with us. Side note, he is currently working on the second draft of the sequel to Lorn Song.
Oh, okay. A little private under the table, a little insider trading going on. Thank you. I'm excited for this info. Um,
I
that's
mean, I've dropped notice of it in a couple places, but it's been quiet.
Okay.
It's all I'm saying right now is it's the sequel. It does not tie directly in, but it's very much got a similar vibe. Um, and it might have something to do with monkeys.
Okay. All right. So I guess on this topic, right? Diverse voices might be the banner, right? The chapter header. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you have been in a production role, by and large, in the past 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
You have just submitted and been accepted for a writing piece for
Yes.
Chris Spivey's new book.
Mm-hmm. Haunted West.
What can you say about that? What was the experience of working with Spivey like?
Um, Chris is a really awesome, really generous guy, and it's been a blast working with him. Um, let's see. I mean, I actually started out as a player in his campaign before Haunted West spun up, and he offered me the chance to write in it.
Okay.
Um,
Oh, you guys are like I don't know the geography of like the
he's in
you're
Northern
like
Virginia,
yeah.
so it is maybe I'm going to say a 45 minute drive over to his place. So
Okay.
not exactly next door, but not far by a long shot.
Sure. Oh, so
Um,
you were a player in what was it just Call of Cthulhu or
so we had let's see, we had one session of a Weird West game,
okay.
Down Darker Trails. We had one session of that, a couple sessions of Shadowrun,
Okay.
and then um, switched over to another system which he's playtesting, which I am NDA'd, but new system playtest.
Okay. Cool.
And then in the middle of that, um, he asked me if I'd be interested in doing a piece for Haunted West, and I had been blown away by Harlem Unbound, right?
Yeah, it's a stunning book.
Um, like it is one of my top RPG books, flat out,
Yeah.
and like I found it really meaningful in giving me a version of the Cthulhu framework that wasn't like the hackneyed, very if okay, so like the default Call of Cthulhu 1920s, as presented traditionally, like it feels kind of rote to me, right? Like um no shade on anyone who likes it, but it's always been something at a bit of a remove. Um, Chris's work takes Lovecraft, directly points out the racism, and directly challenges it and throws it in Lovecraft's face, and gives a version of the mythos that it's possible to really meaningfully engage with. Um, where the horror is just as much the real world horror as it is these fictional Griblies from Beyond Space and Time.
Fictional
And
Griblies? Is that the word you just used?
yep, Griblies.
Okay, I did not know Gribbly was a word.
Gribblie.
What is a Gribbly?
Um, I mean, it's one of those nonsense words like bajillions, right?
Okay.
Um, in this case, referring to some sort of hideous monster that's probably kind of squiggly, maybe green. Um,
Okay, this is a good word. I'm gonna use this. Sorry to interrupt. Continue.
um, so I mean, it takes it, like Call of Cthulhu as presented in default does not really address the sort of Lovecraftian racism elephant in the room. And Harlem Unbound absolutely does, right? Like, absolutely and meaningfully engages with it. Um, the heroes that you're playing are black folks, are queer folks, are immigrants. All the folks Lovecraft hated and feared, and it's great. Um, all of which is a roundabout way of saying that I was extremely excited and honored to be invited to work on Haunted West because it's taking that same framework and applying it to the the Weird West genre
Mhm.
and taking on the challenge of writing meaningful stuff that engages with the racism of the time and the xenophobia and the homophobia and grapples with that and grapples with the same racism, xenophobia, homophobia that we're facing in our current society and meaningfully touches on those. It's a lot, and it's like Harlem Unbound was a very meaningful work, and Haunted West is aiming to be just as meaningful and challenging. And it was a lot of pressure to try and live up to those goals. And I hope I did it justice.
I am sure you did. Um, yeah, I remember when the Deadlands reboot Kickstarter was going, and just being like, how can you go into the world knowing that something knowing that Spivey is doing what he did for Cthulhu with Harlem Unbound, and is doing that for the West, and you're just gonna drop Deadlands, right? And you're just gonna be like, oh yeah, totally. We're just gonna put like a super racist caricature in one of the images, and it's gonna be fine.
Oh,
Um,
yikes.
yeah,
I did not hear about that part.
yeah. It was glossed over. People just didn't pay attention to it, and I'm just like, yeah. Times changed, right? For good.
Yeah.
Okay, so Shadowrun, right? I think
Yeah.
there's a pretty natural segue, right? I love Shadowrun. I do.
Hmm.
I genuinely love it. I think it's a terrible system, but I love the world. Um,
Yeah.
it's also a hella racist game. Um, like in ways big and small. Um, right? I always think of like uh, as technology,
Mm.
the company, right?
Yep.
I'm just like, really, that's gonna be an acceptable and major plot point in your world. That's gonna be one of the biggest corporations there is. They have any city you're gonna play in is gonna have an Aztec office, and it's a caricature writ large, and that is
Yeah.
repeated over and over again. Um,
So, I have a thought on that. That FASA's two standout properties that they worked on, Shadowrun and BattleTech,
mhm,
um, both have an incredible amount of promise and both have incredible pitfalls.
absolutely.
And there are lots of legitimate high points for marginalized folks in those settings,
Hmm.
as well as nails on blackboard cringe low points.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, two
but
of the great houses in BattleTech are just China Land and Japan Land,
yeah,
basically.
and
But there is
very
so much,
stereotyped and ridiculous China land and Japan land.
and yet there is so much amazing in
Yeah.
that game. And I think you're absolutely right. The same is true for Shadowrun. Um,
I mean, side note, like looking through, some of the earliest BattleTech, the technical readouts, right?
mhm.
And I remember like just being thrilled that hey, there's a Muslim guy piloting this mech, and okay, the bit that they wrote about him stopping mid battle to pray, that feels like you didn't actually talk with any Muslim folks, but it's like a legit completely positive like hey, here's this noteworthy mech warrior who is well regarded, honorable, honest, and just around an all around cool dude. um like the thing that sticks with me with Shadowrun, I don't remember I think it was the critic Dia Lucina who wrote it, but
Okay,
don't quote me on that.
sure.
um there's a piece that she wrote discussing the ways in which Shadowrun, specifically as a universe and setting, facilitated her group being able to delve into uh, queer experiences and the experiences of people of color in this future setting, and give them voice in a way that they felt D&D never did.
I totally
And
buy Dia being the person who writes that piece. So yeah, that makes sense.
um, and I didn't have quite that experience until much later, and I can touch on that in a bit. But like the promise of those settings has always been something that I think draws me to them and keeps me coming back, even though they've got these really awful bits, because I think that ultimately, when taken as a whole, they can and do transcend those really awful bits, and it's possible to rework with thought and care, and present them in a way that builds on those very legitimate positives, whilst saying that, hey, there were some really bad screw ups early on. Let's not do those. Let's change them. Um, and actually, a good example of folks doing that is Harebrained Schemes
Yeah,
and their work on the BattleTech title that dropped, and Shadowrun Hong Kong.
I mean,
So
and uh, I'd say the what Dragonfall and Returns.
Dragonfall, yeah.
Yeah,
So confession, I have not played Returns. I got in with Dragonfall.
it's
Um,
okay. So just as an aside, it's
mhm.
fine. It's not very good. Dragonfall and Hong Kong are both far superior. There is a very good mod of Returns that was rebuilt in Hong Kong.
Hmm.
So it's using all the improvements they've made to the game in Hong Kong, but to just resketch out all of Returns.
Nice.
It's free on Nexus mods, so if you're feeling up to it, you can grab
I I may be hitting that up.
it.
um, so Dragonfall was great and like wonderfully tightly written and amazing, but Hong Kong, Shadowrun in Hong Kong, like it was telling a future story uh, about centering and about Asian folks.
Mhm,
There are white characters in there, but they're not the ones who are being focused on.
mhm.
It's uh, it's a vision of the future that isn't centered around white folks, and it meant a hell of a lot to play through that. Um, and BattleTech was the first time I've seen a video game with a Pakistani character, like just flat out the first time. Um, yeah, those games meant a lot to me.
The ship's engineer.
Yep, Dr.
Yeah,
Murad,
yeah,
uh, half Pakistani descent, half Iranian descent.
yeah. I get it. There's like I'm trying to think of the framework for what I want to say.
Hmm?
If you have a good team, you have people who are interested in genuinely doing the right thing with an IP, even if the IP has made some horrible missteps, rehabilitation can be found, right?
I
Like,
think I think that's fair. Um, and you have to be willing to take a hard look at what the what the framework is that you're working in, and consider what it means to continue working in that.
yeah,
And as we're having this discussion, I'm also very cognizant of how some of the things we've been saying about FASA, how that also wraps around back to the OSR.
yeah, totally. Um, there, I think this is kind of the age old fight over the OSR, right? At what point can you trust that the rehabilitative work is being done with in good faith? Um, and I think it took years for people to come around to the idea that it was even possible. And it took bringing in new voices and new people, right? Like, I think it took people who, in a sense, weren't. When I talked to Pam a couple
Hmm.
weeks ago, this was a big thing, right? The RPGC community doesn't have. They have their own baggage, right? But we have this very Western centric focused on rehabilitation a lot of times. Um, Pam was like, "Yeah, I like White Wolf, and I like games that like have problems, but I can do interesting work with them. I can make them better. I don't need to just drop them
Hmm.
forever. I can I can take this thing I love that's deeply flawed, and maybe I can't delete its past from the records, but I shouldn't have to, right? I just need to do a really good job examining it and improving it moving forward." Um, I think that's an unpopular opinion
I
for a
mean,
lot of people.
yeah, and I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm also sympathetic to folks who say, "No, man, it's too much for me. There's too much baggage. I can't go back to this." Like, that's fair. That's not where I'm at. That's, not where my design is going to be. That's not where my interest is going to be. But if it's something that you don't feel like you can come back to, then that's entirely legit. I respect the thought process that goes into that. And I mean, like, there are folks out there who have said, "Yo, I'm never going to look at an OSR game because of the crappy reputation that that community has."
Sure.
And I'm like, "Yeah, okay, fair enough."
Yeah.
um like, I can't change what's been written in the past. Like, past is the past. All I can do is try and do good, thoughtful work going forward and try to make spaces and communities that move past the toxicity, harm, and abuse that have been present.
100%. Um, yeah, I can't tell anyone how. I often do, but I shouldn't tell people how they should believe. Right? I do it all the time, but I shouldn't. Um, okay, so transitioning on the same topic to maybe a slightly more positive note. Who who are some people doing today that kind of rehabilitative work that you think are doing a really, really good, interesting, thoughtful job of it?
Hmm. Let's see. Um, ZDEC is, as unsurprisingly, front and center in this list. Um, Evelyn Moreau would be very high up on my list as well.
Okay.
Um, like, both of them acknowledge the frameworks that they're working in design wise, and a lot of the really crappy stuff that's been done, but they still feel that, hey, there's a valid framework in here to create the kind of worlds and frameworks that they want to create about and to facilitate people engaging with. Um, I even put together a whole list of people who I feel should be
And just,
should be on.
it's out.
It's out.
Yeah.
um,
The
th-
eternal
th-
struggle.
yep, this is something I could effectively respond to if you gave me a moment to, like, sit down and pull up a Twitter list and list this person or that person. But
That's always the way of it. Um,
yeah. Um, oh, actually, one person I do want to shout out, um, Johnstone Metzger. Um, and working on the Nightmares Beneath, Nightmares Underneath. I
Underneath.
always
Yeah.
underneath. Thank you. That was a really awesome work. Much earlier, looking at
Yeah, when? How early was that? Like 2014?
uh, 13 or 14. I want to nearly
Okay,
say
yeah, it's by no means old, but certainly an older title.
yes. Um, and it pushed at the type of fantasy that was being done within the OSR framework. It's very much not Eurocentric. It's challenging some of the basic frameworks. It uh,
I mean,
it meant a great deal to see something that wasn't you know Eurocentric.
yeah. By way of
That
explanation, uh, Nightmares Underneath is a dungeon delving game where the dungeons are essentially mental constructs, right? Um, and it is not your typical Western fantasy. It is, I don't know, how would you describe it? Kind of like Arabian Nights.
not Arabian Nights. I'd say, if memory serves, it's um, Persian Islamic era inspiration more
Okay,
so than Arabian Nights.
gotcha.
It's actually kind of funny. Like um, the campaign setting I've been developing for D&D has also very consciously been Islamic fantasy, yes, but not Arabian Nights.
Okay. Um, yeah, if I think about the cover of the book, it is like vaguely reminiscent of a copy, like a nice Islamic religious text. The like design work on the copy of the book, so that actually makes sense. Though I don't think that's true of the second book because there was an expansion to it, right?
There was, but I don't remember the cover art for the expansion.
Yeah. And I also don't remember the name for it. Okay, Metzger is an interesting case. Have you read any of his other stuff?
No, I've looked at it, but it never like latched on in the same way that Nightmares Underneath did.
Sure.
So
His it's definitely less so, but I will say that the he has a series of dungeon world adventures. I am not a big DW fan in general. Certainly not now of all times, but like, I was never a big DW fan in the past, really.
hmm.
His are interesting. They do neat and non traditional things even within the framework of Western fantasy.
Oh, cool.
So he has that mindset about him, even when he's not going as far askance, which is good to see.
I mean, like Dungeon World is very not my thing, but I hadn't realized he had done Dungeon World Adventures, and would definitely be interested in picking those up.
I think he did 3 of them.
Hmm.
They're all on drive through.
Oh, right on.
Yeah. Mabel.
Mabel Harper, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sad that she's stepped back from RPGs. I'm hoping that she'll be willing to come back to them. Um, no, she's done some awesome work. I really want to run or play in Steel Weaver's Rebellion, I
Mm-hmm.
think is the name of her. Um,
Explicitly leftist blades.
yep.
Heck yeah.
We had been interesting. We had been interested in working with her on publishing that, but um, just did not have the bandwidth. Which, side note, is a recurring issue.
Yeah. I mean, to be entirely honest, I'm shocked given the world we're in now that you have any bandwidth at all.
I mean,
When you hit me up a few days ago, being like, "Hey, I've totally spaced about our interview," I was like, "Dude, I didn't expect to hear from you for like 6 months." Um, so
I mean, like, there's a whole lot of stuff going on in the world. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in my particular area of legal practice, and basically all of it is bad.
yeah,
And having nice, fun things to help leaven that helps a lot.
fair, fair enough. Yeah, I could see how that would be the case. Um, trying to think if there's anything else. We're at 75 minutes, which is technically long enough, but also it's by no means the entirety. If there are other interesting topics, I am down to stick around for a long time.
I'm
Um,
happy to keep talking for a while also.
cool.
I probably couldn't do more than another hour, but
Fair. I mean, that would still put you at probably as long. That's close to the longest one I've done. Um, what do you play at home?
um, so right now, like, um, bandwidth and the ability to devote time to games is relatively low campaign wise.
Sure.
Um, so right now it's still Chris Katalik's Hill Canton's game.
That's
Is
still
kind of
ongoing?
yep.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
I mean there have been pauses and breaks, but like especially this past year was mostly on hold. But yep, it's back up and running.
Okay.
Um,
What do you play that over now?
we're using Zoom these days. We'd been using Google Hangouts for a long time, and now Chris wound up getting, I guess, a premium Zoom thing for work, and hey, he can use this for games.
Yeah, the premium one has some nice functions.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so
So it's that. In the pre-COVID times, I'd still been in Chris Spivey's playtesting game,
mhm,
and I wound up having to step back from that uh, just before COVID hit because I got engaged, and I'm like, this will eat up a lot of my time. I'm not going to be able to make it out to those monthly games, and it turned out that it wouldn't eat up that much of my time because venue selection and visiting all those places a lot more difficult under quarantine.
yeah, yeah, I can imagine. One, congrats. Two, terrible
Thank you.
timing. Um, but but I hope things are at least progressing somewhat.
Yes, they're progressing. Things are going well. Um, Lots of wrangling over stuff even now, but we're still going to, you know, we're still going to be getting married in October. Still going to have some sort of ceremony, figuring out the contours and how to deal with safety precautions in the current circumstances.
Sure, yeah. People are still getting married. It's it's not going to stop. Um, okay, I mean that makes sense. I mean we talked about Hairbrain's games briefly, right?
Yeah.
Do you do you feel there are video games that are also doing the work? I mean, obviously, I feel like there are, but like, are there any that come to mind beyond HBS?
Um. So I'm gonna I pay attention to video games discussion, but it's not really my focus because I'm at best playing games that are like 3 or 4 years out of date.
Sure.
Um, I think BattleTech, because I backed the Kickstarter, was one of the few times that I was like, "Oh, I'm playing a game that's just been released, same as everyone else." um,
I mean, and
but
you made an excellent choice of that one. I will say. Have you played it with all the like expansions and whatnot?
yeah,
It is
I
so good.
Yeah, I'm actually currently in a playthrough right now, starting with the official campaign, but with all the expansions equipped and turned on.
Nice.
And yeah, uh, um, let's see. Do want to note the one place for games criticism that's been very high on my list is Vice Games, formerly called Waypoint.
Waypoints. Yeah.
Um, they've been a very good, very thoughtful place for video games discussion, journalism, critique. Um, there's a really excellent crew there, and they've got a podcast. And every time I listen to that podcast,
So
I get
good.
excited about games and want to get back into creating stuff.
It's the only digital games pod that I listen to. At this point, like Austin Walker and Rob Zachney and like that
Yep.
whole team, like when I hear their voices, I just get happy.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
they
that's
just do
fair.
such good work. Um, Honestly, I just wish they wrote more about analog. Like I know Austin's the
Mm.
only one who's like on the team who pays attention to the space.
Not quite. Not quite.
Well, I guess
Gita
Zachney does uh,
Zachney does war
war
games
games.
and some tabletop stuff. And actually, tying it back to an earlier conversation, um, Gita Jackson just heard about Harlem Unbound.
Really? Uh, oh, was that when Gita tweeted about uh, people of color
Black,
in analog games and being like, I don't know anybody.
yeah,
Did somebody reply about Harlem Unbound?
yep. I think she was specifically asking about black creators,
Okay,
and yeah, folks shouted out Harlem Unbound, and yeah,
tight. Okay, is Gita on? She's been on the Waypoint pod like a lot lately, but I thought she was at Kotaku.
no, she left Kotaku and is now, I think, splitting her time between Waypoint and Motherboard. I'm not sure what the exact breakdown is.
Okay,
I think that the lines on those teams have gotten a bit fuzzy because Vice like restructured their
yeah.
departments, and honestly, there is a non-trivial amount of overlap between those two spaces.
I mean, that's when Danielle Riendo moved off of Waypoint and was put on like Vice Teen or something.
That
Um,
sounds right. Yeah,
okay, cool. Good to know. Um, Speaking of war games and Waypoint and all that, do you listen to Three Moves Ahead?
absolutely. Three
Yeah.
Moves Ahead is where I heard Rob and actually Austin before I started listening to Waypoint.
Okay.
Um, like one of the Three Moves Ahead episodes that I really really loved was um, shoot, what's the name of it? There's one game that's like a cyberpunk real time tactics game. Something Rainfall or Silent Rain or something like that. Um,
I think I don't remember the name of the game or even the game itself, but I like vaguely recall Austin and Rob talking about it, about like some crazy scenario of like something to do with a shotgun.
I don't
Um,
remember the shotgun bit, but yeah, that's that podcast, that episode. Like, it very vividly sticks out in my mind because it was Rob and Austin and someone else who Rob and Austin and someone else, but it
sure.
was my first time being exposed to Austin's perspective and voice, and that podcast has stuck with me for years. Um, I mean, part of it is that I remember I was listening to it at a particularly stressful time, so it sticks out. But also part of it is like this one episode in particular blew me away and got me really excited. And I was very glad to find out that, oh, this guy's got a whole nother podcast where he talks with Rob Zachney and other folks.
Yep. And has a whole other podcast where he plays role playing games.
Yeah. Um, I have tried to get into Friends at the Table, and I dearly want to, particularly since I know they've got the Counterweight game, which has a Stars Without Number component.
Interesting.
Um, but for whatever reason, it's been hard for me to latch on to like the Counterweight intro
Okay.
or the first episode, so I should probably try one of the other ones and dig in that way.
I mean, this is a problem I have with APs, right? It's just it's a format that I don't vibe with in the same way that like I can deal with narrative pods, right? Like Magnus Archives is probably my all-time favorite podcast,
Hmm.
and it's just narrative. I can deal with conversational podcasts. That's most of what I listen to. APs just occupy this really uncomfortable place where I'm not sure what like mode my brain is supposed to be in when I'm listening, and I'm just like completely taken out of it. And however much I love Austin and like a lot of the Friends of the Table crew, I just yeah, I've listened to a few episodes. The series of episodes they did with Cold Winter, Cecil Howe's
Hmm.
thing.
I did not know they did one with Cold Winter.
They
That's
did like
awesome.
4 episodes with it, um, and like I worked through that, and it was tight hearing them play that, but also like I couldn't just like that starts a campaign, and I just couldn't bother with the rest of it.
Hmm.
Um,
So there was one actual play show that I really loved. Um, Death from Above, which was originally run as a promo for HBS Battletech
okay,
and had several HBS staff and friends working on it. And
who
I
were they
really loved
playing?
it.
Mech
There,
Warrior.
there, yeah, it was Battletech for the mech battles, and then a hacked version of like Tristat or something for the interpersonal parts.
Okay,
Um,
Death from Above.
Death from Above. It
Okay.
was really cool, and I love a lot of the cast there. But the GM that they had for the first two seasons is the HBS staff member who was terminated for being a sketchy abuser.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. And like, I have a bit of cognitive dissonance because I have so many positive memories of that show and of the team. And this
Yeah,
asshat is in all those memories.
yeah.
Um,
Wow, I'd completely blocked out that that had happened.
mm,
But yeah, I remember that shit falling apart in real time.
yeah. Um,
Oof, oof.
yeah.
God, to have like so much time and so many positive memories just sullied like that.
I mean, because I was like part of the DFA fandom, I got to know Strix Beltran
Mm-hmm.
and her husband. I got to know some of the, like Mitch Gittleman, the
Yep, head of HBS.
HBS, right? Like, I became Twitter and Facebook friends with them. Like, you know, um, so uh, I actually like I was sufficiently into DFA that like it was that noticing like, oh, the sort of reactions I have to the cast and crew. Oh, this is kind of like what people have in their the parasocial
Mm-hmm.
relationship,
Yeah,
right? Like that sort of one-way connection with celebrities and podcasters, and I think that was the first time I actively noticed that, oh, this is how I'm feeling towards this crew. Um, which is part of why it hurts so much that like someone who I really liked and was very engaged with and was someone who I was like, oh, let me watch this person and learn from what he's doing for creating my own BattleTech campaigns. And oh,
yeah.
oh no, oh shit. um narrator narrator's voice, this would be a recurring problem in the RPG industry.
Yeah, Jesus Christ, it really is. Um, sorry, dude. That's a rough one.
I mean, hey, like, as has been noted, the OSR has had, one very major voice who was, several magnitudes worse um, in his influence and his, and his crimes.
Yeah, and several
So,
lesser voices, if we're being honest as well.
yeah.
Um,
Although I think the lesser voices, like, never had as much impact on me as the one major one of Zach S. Right?
sure.
Like I was, you know, uh, for a long time, and far too long, very impressed with the with the work he was doing, and wound up not seeing a lot of the awfulness and malevolence until you know a few years too late. I'm like, oh no, no, this is going from you know brilliant nice guy to brilliant but kind of a jerk to asshole but brilliant to no, this guy is pure poison. And it took me too long to get there, but I got there. um
I mean, back on. Okay, this is a really weird transition, so I'm gonna have to clarify. Back on the rehabilitative track, right? Not to
mhm.
mean let's rehabilitate him, because fuck that forever.
Yeah.
But I think there's an element of like having to recognize that people don't realize these things always in real time. That like if you're enmeshed in them, it takes a while to do the work of parceling yourself out of it, to then do the work of improving it.
Yeah.
I think the thing that really turned me around on the OSR in the past few years, other than just the quality of the work being done by interesting new voices, is how many people hit that point where they go, oh, I can't deny this anymore.
Mm.
And on the one hand, what could have happened is everyone just disappears into the background and never be heard again. And I think at the time that's what a lot of people wanted. And instead, what happened is this kind of continuing struggle of like, yeah, we messed up in a really, really, really fucking big way.
Yeah.
And we're going to do our mea culpa, and then we're going to fix this shit. And we're going to clean house, and we're going to improve. I think when we are, as you said before, if a person elects, if a person chooses, for any reason, not to want to do the rehabilitative work, that's a valid choice. But I think we're collectively better when there are people who decide to stick around and do it.
um, there's a friend I have, internet friend, Jack Norris, not to be confused with the irritating Marvel character. No, this Jack Norris is um, I think freelancer for Green Ronin and
Mm-hmm.
a couple others. But the way he put it that stuck with me was, Nazis get nothing,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of apply this to other areas as well. If there's something that you've created and that has merit, and you have bad actors who've laid claim to that space, um, there is a strong merit to trying to ensure that they don't have that and that you fight them for it. In some cases, it's necessary to you know it's necessary to say no. This part is something that you wall off and chuck
Totally.
away because it's not possible to rehabilitate it. But if you can, it doesn't hurt to try.
Yeah. Um, well put.
Thank you.
I don't know. I just it's a very it's succinct and it's exactly how I feel. Um,
So, I mean,
this
to
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
No. You go.
I mean, to link it to the thing we alluded to regarding Dungeon World and right now, like a lot of people have been saying, yo, I can't go back to Dungeon World. Adam Koebel is freaking terrible. Um, and to the like that's an entirely legit reaction. But I'm also not going to look askance at someone who says, yeah, Adam Koebel did some really messed up stuff, and that's going to change how I look at him. But I'm still going to try and create within this paradigm because it's a paradigm that speaks to me. Now, it's not a paradigm that I personally can
Sure.
get into because I don't like Dungeon World,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that's neither here nor there, right?
yeah.
Like it's something that works for them, and they still feel passionate about, and it's possible to, I think, do good in that space without being dragged down. Um, and to make it your own instead of something that's his and his alone. I think there's a cutoff point for that. I don't think you can do that with, say, the Varg Vikernes RPG.
God, no,
But
no, I don't think there's a way to do that with my frog. No, or Adventure Conqueror King, or something like that. Like, no, I think there are games that are a bridge too far that you will never and should never even try to rehabilitate. Um,
I, with Adventure Conqueror King, um, like I don't think that um, there's sort of the baked in on a system level terribleness that there is in My Frog, but I also don't think that it offers anything that's sufficiently worthwhile to
sure,
merit that
that's fair.
merit the
It
shot
is
for.
it is at a mechanical level, not as overtly white nationalist as My Frog.
Yeah,
Um, but it is also like it is a game that it, what could the effort of attempting to rehabilitate Adventurer Conqueror King accomplish with a game less damned?
yeah, like I do not advocate folks picking that up and trying, but
What a
but I think
project!
that
What a doom project! But yeah, I take the point you're making. I do. Um, wow, did not think we were gonna. This is kind of a joke. I end up bringing up Adventure Conqueror King and My Frog a lot, um, but like as in jest, like as
mm,
examples of terrible things. I
yeah.
genuinely did not expect them to be brought up by anyone who wasn't me ever in any
Haha,
of these
the tables
interviews.
have
They
turned.
they really have. This is deeply surreal. Um, all right, shit. Wow, I'm like stunned. Okay, so I don't think I've I don't think I have anything else. This has been really
Legit.
really good.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been really cool.
Yeah, no.
I'm glad we had a chance to, you know, talk face to face. I wish we had a chance to do this at a con over coffee or something,
I
but
mean,
hey,
maybe there's a second volume at some point where I actually do these in person when the world reverts to having conventions again.
right
Um,
on. And hey, even if there isn't a second volume, if we're ever at a con together, let's grab that tasty beverage.
Absolutely, dude. I would love to. All right.
Likewise.
You have a good night. Be well. Keep doing rad shit, man. All
Thank you.
right.
You as well. Have a
Peace.
good one.